There is a particular kind of cold that does not merely lower the temperature, but changes the character of the world entirely, turns familiar ground into hostile territory, buries every soft edge under a white weight that does not forgive hesitation. And that was exactly the kind of cold that had settled over the mountain township of Crestfall Ridge on the second Tuesday of January, when Chief Petty Officer Marin Solace, 8 months out of the Navy and not yet entirely certain what to do with that fact, pulled her truck off Route 9 and cut the engine in the parking lot of the only hardware store still open past 4 in the afternoon. The errand was small: a bag of ice melt for the cabin steps, a replacement bulb for the porch light, maybe a can of soup if she felt generous toward herself, which lately she had not. She was not supposed to be the kind of person who needed reminding to eat, but grief has its own dietary preferences, and hers had narrowed her appetite to almost nothing in the months since she had come home to a life that no longer had the shape she had left it in. She had been a Navy SEAL combat diver and later a SEAL support asset, which is a careful way of saying that she had done the kind of work that does not appear on resumes, that is acknowledged only in the private language of people who have been in the same rooms and survived the same silences. She was 34 years old, strong in the way that is not decorative, with a bad shoulder that gave weather reports more accurately than any app, and a scar along the left collarbone she had stopped explaining. In the breast pocket of her canvas work jacket, she carried, folded into a square no larger than a playing card, a photograph of a man named Ruiz, her partner and the person she trusted most in the world, who had died 11 months ago in a training accident that was not, according to the official report, anyone's fault. She had read that report 4 times. She did not believe it, but she had also learned in her years of service that belief without evidence is only noise, and she had no evidence, only the weight of the photograph against her sternum, and the particular silence that lives where a person used to be. The hardware store was warm and smelled of machine oil and rubber matting and the dry burn of a space heater working past its capacity. She moved down the aisles with the economical attention of a person trained to assess spaces quickly, noted the 2 exits, the position of the single clerk, and the narrow back hall that led to a stockroom. She was not doing this on purpose. She had been trying to stop. Her therapist, a patient woman in Billings named Dr. Okafor, called this hypervigilance and described it as her nervous system's attempt to protect her from a threat that no longer existed. Marin had not yet found a polite way to explain that the threat absolutely still existed. She just did not know its current address. She collected her ice melt, her bulb, and after a moment's deliberation, a can of chicken soup and a second can of black beans, which felt like progress. She paid without making conversation beyond the necessary, nodded to the clerk, and pushed back out through the glass door into the cold. The parking lot sat at the edge of a small commercial strip that petered out at the north end into a narrow service alley, and then into the open ground of what had once been a rail yard and was now a frozen expanse of gravel and black ice bordered by chain link and the beginning of the tree line. The storm that had been promised for 3 days was arriving, not with drama but with the quiet efficiency of something that has nothing to prove, laying down its first serious inches in a steady curtain that reduced the tree line to a suggestion and the service alley to a gray smear. Marin loaded her bag into the back of the truck and stood for a moment in the way she sometimes did, breathing the cold and letting it simplify her. Cold was honest. It did not ask you how you were doing. It did not look at you with that particular combination of pity and relief that meant they were glad the loss had not been theirs. She would have gotten in the truck. That had been the plan. But there was a dog in the service alley. She knew it before she fully registered it, in the way that attention trained to read landscape picks up an anomaly before the conscious mind catches up. Something moving wrong, close to the ground, low and reluctant, Not the fluid movement of an animal at ease in its environment, but the labored, head-down drag of one that is working through pain. A large dog, from what she could see, dark-coated, heavy-boned, moving in the direction of the dumpsters with the specific, focused purpose of an animal looking for something to sustain it. She stood and watched it for 3 seconds, which in Marin's internal economy was a considered pause, not a delay. Then she watched something else. A black SUV had been idling at the far end of the service alley. The kind of vehicle that costs more than most families' annual income, buffed to a mirror finish that the snow was beginning to render moot. The passenger door opened and a man climbed out, and Marin noted him with the same automatic assessment she applied to all things in uncertain terrain. 60s, she thought. Maybe early 60s, though money had a way of softening the evidence of age on some faces. A charcoal overcoat that reached his knees, the kind of tailoring that sits differently than anything sold within 400 miles of Crestfall Ridge. Silver hair swept back, with the confidence of a man who has never had to wonder whether his appearance was working in his favor. He was on a phone call, speaking in the low, carrying tone of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his voice. He glanced at the dog. The dog had angled toward him, not in aggression but in the unmistakable posture of an animal approaching a human and hoping for something, the particular vulnerability of a creature that has not yet been taught to expect the worst. The man's foot moved before his expression changed. A smooth, almost impatient arc, the way you would move a piece of furniture that had inconvenienced you, and his boot connected with the dog's ribs with enough force to send the animal stumbling sideways into the alley wall. The dog made a sound, brief and sharp, and then pressed itself flat against the bricks, and went still in the way animals go still when they are recalculating their odds. Marin was already moving. She was not moving in anger, precisely. Anger was something that had to compete for space with a great many other things she carried, and in the moment of motion it had not yet elbowed its way to the front. What was moving her was something more instinctive and less complicated than rage. She had seen that posture in the dog, the approach with hope, the willingness to trust, and she had recognized it in the way you recognize something that was once also true of yourself. She reached the alley in 6 strides, her boots finding grip on the black ice without apparent effort, and she positioned herself between the man and the dog with the kind of stillness that is its own statement. He looked at her. He did not look alarmed. Men like this, she had found, rarely looked alarmed at women who arrived without introduction. He looked mildly inconvenienced, which was, if anything, worse. She said, "That's not your dog to kick." He said, "Excuse me?" with the particular inflection of a man for whom that phrase had always functioned as a door closing rather than a question. "You heard me," Marin said. She was not loud. She did not need to be. There was a pause in which he seemed to be deciding what category she belonged to, and she watched him make the calculation and arrive at the wrong answer. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, still smooth, still in the register of mild inconvenience. "But that animal is a stray and a nuisance, and you'd do well to mind your business." He turned back toward the SUV. He said something into the phone, something low, something with a laugh folded into it. And he got in, and the door closed, and the black vehicle eased out of the far end of the alley and was gone into the snow. Marin stood in the alley and breathed for a moment. Then she turned to the dog. The dog had not run. It was watching her from its position against the wall, head low, body taut with the compressed readiness of an animal that has been through enough to know that benevolence and danger can arrive in the same shape. She crouched slowly, not reaching, just lowering herself to its level, which was a form of respect she had learned from people who understood animals the way she understood water, as something that had its own intelligence and resented being managed. The dog was a German shepherd, or mostly so, large and dark-saddled, and even in the poor light of the storm, she could see that it was underweight in the way that takes months to achieve, the kind of thinness that means not a bad week, but a hard season. Its left foreleg was being held slightly off the ground. Around its neck, almost buried in the dirty ruff of fur, was a collar, military-style nylon in olive drab, and from the collar hung a small metal tag that caught the thin light. She could not read it from where she was crouching. She reached back and retrieved her bag from where she had set it on the ground, found the small flashlight she carried from habit, clicked it on, and read the tag. There were 2 lines. The first line was a number, the second line was a word, and the word was Atlas. She said the name quietly, testing it. The dog's ears came up, both of them. It was not quite a greeting, not quite recognition, but it was something. It was orientation. It was the small, declarative signal of an animal that knows its own name and has not yet decided whether knowing it will help here. Marin said, "Okay, Atlas, let's get you out of this cold." She did not pick him up, because a dog in pain held by a stranger is a dog on the edge of a decision you do not want it to make. Instead, she stood and moved toward her truck slowly, watching his response from the edge of her peripheral vision. And he followed, head still low, that left foreleg still careful, following her the way animals sometimes follow. People who have not yet given them a reason not to. She opened the passenger door, and he studied the height for a moment, and then got in with a grunt of effort that went straight to the middle of her chest, and stayed there. She got in the driver's side and looked at him. He looked at her. The snow hit the windshield in the expanding silence of a storm, finding its rhythm. She touched the pocket where the photograph lived, a small, involuntary motion she had never fully managed to stop, and then she started the truck. The cabin was 12 minutes from town on a good road, which this road was working to stop being. She drove without the radio, which she usually kept off, her attention split between the narrowing visibility and the dog on the seat beside her, who was doing the things a dog in pain does quietly. The periodic small repositioning, the shallow breathing, the studied neutrality of an animal that has learned to take up as little space as possible. At the worst patch of the road, where the grade dropped and then rose, and the trees came close on both sides, he leaned very slightly against her arm, not pressing, not asking, simply making contact the way some living things do when the dark gets larger, as if warmth is both the thing needed and the only currency available. She did not pull away. The cabin was small, and she had kept it that way deliberately. 2 rooms and a loft, a wood stove, a covered porch, a well that still worked, and a generator she had tested more times than necessary. It had been her grandmother's cabin, and she had bought it from the estate with 6 months of back pay, partly because it was affordable and partly because it was as far from anyone else's expectations as she could get within the continental United States. She had been living there for 8 months, with very little to show for it in the way of progress toward what Dr. Okafor called reintegration, which Marin privately thought of as the project of learning to live in a world where Ruiz was not. She had made the cabin clean. She had made it functional. She had not yet made it a home, and she knew the difference, because she had grown up in a home and had been in enough temporary billets to recognize that the distance between the two was not a matter of furniture. She got the dog inside and onto the rag rug in front of the wood stove, which was warm from its afternoon banking, and she did a methodical triage with the flashlight and clean hands. The ribs on the left side, where the boot had connected, were tender to careful pressure, but she did not feel the give of a break, which was a mercy. The foreleg was the larger problem. There was an old wound there, mostly healed but not cleanly, the kind of scar tissue that forms when a laceration closes without adequate treatment, puckered and thickened in a way that suggested it had been significant. Whatever had caused it some weeks ago. She thought about the man in the alley, and the boot connecting with those ribs, and the practiced ease of it, the way a person moves when they have done a thing before and expect no consequence, and she felt the anger which had been waiting patiently take up its full amount of space. She fed the dog the chicken soup from the can, warmed on the stove, and transferred to a bowl, which he ate with a careful patience that undid her in some small structural way she could not immediately name. She sat on the floor beside him while he ate, and she looked at the metal tag in her hand, and she thought about the number on it, and she thought about the word on it, and she thought about how a military-collared dog with a tactical name ended up underweight and injured in a service alley in Crestfall Ridge. And she thought about the man in the charcoal overcoat who had kicked him without breaking his phone conversation. And she thought that these things were related in a way that had not yet shown her its full shape. She stayed on the floor until the wood stove had pushed the room into the warm range, and the dog had finished eating and lowered his head onto his paws with a long, unguarded exhalation, the sound of a body deciding, cautiously, that this was an acceptable place to rest. She put her hand on his back, not petting, just resting it there, weight and warmth, presence, without demand. She said nothing. Neither did he, and the silence between them was not empty. In the morning the storm had not abated, but it had organized itself, which was almost better. A committed storm is at least coherent. The snow was coming down in the flat, determined way of a storm that has made its decision and intends to follow through, and the road to town was not impassable, but was working on it. Atlas had slept through the night on the rag rug, and she had slept in the chair beside him in the way she sometimes slept, when she did not trust the distance between herself and something fragile, which was how she had slept for the first 3 months after she came home, close to the door, close to the window, close to whatever needed watching. She had made her calls before first light. The first was to the Crestfall Ridge Animal Services line, which went to voicemail because it was 6 in the morning. The second was to the county warden's office, which also went to voicemail, and she left a careful message about finding an injured dog with a military-style collar and a number on his tag, and her opinion that the dog's condition warranted some kind of official inquiry. The third call was the one she had taken 15 minutes to decide to make, and it went to a cell phone number she had copied from a business card tacked to the bulletin board in the hardware store, because the bulletin board in the hardware store in Crestfall Ridge was where you found everything, from hay for sale to snow clearing services to the card of the one licensed, large animal and working dog veterinarian who covered the northern townships. The card read, Dr. Petra Nance, DVM, Working Dog Medicine and Rehabilitation. The handwriting on the back of the card, added in pencil, read, Honest hours, call anyway. She called. It rang 4 times, and then a woman answered with the flat, immediate alertness of someone who lives near the phone, because emergencies do not schedule themselves. Marin described what she had. The injury profile, the collar, the tag number, the dog's weight relative to his frame, the old wound on the foreleg, the fresh bruising on the ribs. She described these things in the sequential, non-dramatic manner of a person trained to give situation reports. And there was a short silence on the other end, and then Dr. Petra Nance said, How bad is the foreleg contracture? And Marin said, Moderate. He's bearing some weight, but compensating significantly. And Dr. Nance said, Don't let him do stairs. I'll be there in 40 minutes if the road lets me. She was there in 35. She was not what Marin had pictured, though Marin had been trying not to picture anything, having learned that pictures were just pre-made disappointments. Dr. Nance was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact and efficient-looking in her movements, dressed in the kind of layered, practical clothing that means a person spends real time outdoors in real weather. She had a face that had been pretty once, and had grown into something better than pretty. Something weathered into a more permanent kind of interesting, and she had the specific quality of composure Marin associated with people who had lost something significant and had found a way to carry it without letting it change their gait. She carried a field bag that had seen considerable use, and she shook Marin's hand with the grip of a person who has spent her professional life demonstrating capability to people who initially doubt it. She knelt beside Atlas without ceremony and began her examination with the quiet, unhurried focus of a person who has done this 1,000 times and still takes it seriously every single time. Atlas watched her with the same careful assessment he had turned on Marin in the alley, the head-low attention of an animal that has learned to separate trustworthy from tolerable. And somewhere, in the first 2 minutes of the examination, his head went down and his eyes half closed. And Marin noted this with the part of her mind that was always filing evidence. Dr. Nance said, "He's malnourished, but not critically. The ribs are bruised, not broken. The foreleg is the problem. This scar tissue is months old. He's been compensating for it long enough that the musculature on that side has begun to atrophy." She pressed along the old wound's edge and Atlas made a sound, controlled and low. She said, "Sorry, boy," and meant it in the way people mean things when they are sorry for causing necessary pain, which is the most honest kind of sorrow. She said to Marin, "This wasn't an accident. Whatever caused this original wound, it wasn't a dog fight or a running injury. The geometry is wrong for that. This is consistent with a restraint injury, possibly a cable trap or a deliberate cutting restraint. Something that held him down." Marin said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What kind of operation would use a military-collared dog named Atlas, and then let him sustain a restraint injury and not treat it?" Dr. Nance looked up from the examination. She held Marin's gaze with the direct attention of a person who has stopped flinching at uncomfortable implications. She said, "The kind that considers the dog expendable." She paused. She said, "Or the kind that's trying to make a dog disappear quietly." She turned the collar tag in her fingers. She said, "This number, it's a registry format. I've seen this before, this particular collar style and tagging system. There's one organization I know of that uses it. It's a private K-9, training and security contracting outfit operating out of the county north of here. Harrow County." She said the name of the county without emphasis, but something in the absence of emphasis told Marin that the name carried weight. They contract with some of the regional mining and extraction operations. They also do what they call disposal assessments of working dogs that are no longer viable assets. Marin said, "Disposal assessments. Yes. That means what I think it means. It means exactly what you think it means." Marin looked at Atlas, who had settled onto his side with the careful deliberateness of an animal locating the precise angle at which a particular combination of injuries hurts the least. She thought about the word disposal and what it required of the people who used it, the deliberate grammar of it, the way language gets drafted into the service of cruelty and comes out the other side, looking like policy. She put her hand on the photograph in her pocket. She said, "His number, can you trace it?" Dr. Nance said, "I have contacts at the State Registry Board for working animal certifications. It will take a day, maybe 2. The record may have already been altered. These operations have a way of preemptively cleaning their documentation." She paused. "But they can't clean everything. They never do. People are always somewhere under the paperwork." They worked together for the next 2 hours. Dr. Nance directing and Marin assisting, and there was a functional ease to it that surprised Marin with its immediacy. The way competent people sometimes find a shared language faster than ordinary people find a shared topic of conversation. Dr. Nance debrided the old wound's edges carefully, administered an antibiotic protocol, taped the ribs, and left a regimen of anti-inflammatories with calm, specific instructions that she did not repeat twice, because she had understood within the first 10 minutes of Marin's presence that this was not a woman who needed things repeated. She said Atlas would need rest, controlled movement only, and follow-up in 72 hours. She said the prognosis was good if the leg was managed properly. She said this with the restraint of a person who does not promise outcomes she cannot guarantee, but with the undertone of a person who also does not catastrophize. At the door, pulling on her outer layer, Dr. Nance paused. She said, "The man you described in the alley. Silver hair, tailored coat, black SUV with plates you didn't catch." She said this without looking at Marin, adjusting her collar with her eyes on the middle distance. That description matches a man named Callum Vresh. He owns Harrow Ridge Extraction. He sits on the county land use board. He funds the children's literacy program at the township library and the new wing of the medical center in Sutter Flats. She said, "He is considered a pillar." Marin said, "What do you consider him?" Dr. Nance looked at her then. She said, "I consider him the reason my colleague, Dr. James Farrow, who was documenting conditions at the Harrow Ridge K9 facility 2 years ago, died in a hiking accident in terrain that James Farrow had been hiking safely for 20 years. She said this flatly. She said it the way a person says a thing they have said to themselves many times and have not yet found a way to say to anyone who might do anything about it. She said, "I have his field notes. He mailed them to me. Copies only," he said, "in case anything happens. I've been waiting 2 years for someone to give me a reason to open that envelope." She said, "I think you might be that reason." She left. The truck disappeared into the white obliteration of the storm. Marin stood at the door for a moment and breathed, and the cold came in around her, honest and direct and utterly without agenda. She thought, ground, breath, name. The 3 things she had been taught to use to tether herself when the world went sideways: the ground under her boots, real and resistive, the breath going in and out, simple and continuous, the name she carried, not allowed but held, because carrying a name is its own form of presence. Ruiz, she had learned in 11 months that grief was not a room you left, but a room you learned to live in, while also living in the other rooms, and she was still learning the navigation. But she had learned something else tonight, something that had arrived in the shape of a large, battered dog eating chicken soup from a bowl on her floor, which was that mercy does not ask you to be undamaged first. It just asks you to show up. She went back inside and sat with Atlas on the rug, and outside the storm, settled in for the night with all the patience of something that knows it has the time. She spent the next morning going through what she had, which was not much, but was more than nothing, which she had also learned to treat as significant. She had a dog with a military registry collar and a numbered tag. She had a name, Atlas. She had a description of a wound profile consistent with deliberate restraint injury and a history of criminal neglect. She had the name of an extraction company and its owner. She had the knowledge that there was a K9 facility somewhere in Harrow County. She had, somewhere in a sealed envelope, in the hands of Dr. Petra Nance, the field notes of a dead veterinarian. She assembled these things on the kitchen table in her mind, the way she had assembled intelligence in the field, not hurrying the picture, letting the shapes define themselves before she committed to a theory of their arrangement. Atlas watched her from the rug with the calm, participatory attention of a dog that has spent its working life tracking the behavior of humans and has learned to read the difference between a person thinking and a person deciding. He had eaten again that morning, a proper dog meal this time, and his color was better, and he had moved from the rug to the kitchen doorway under his own navigation without prompting, which Dr. Nance had said was exactly the kind of cautious, self-directed movement that indicated a good prognosis. He was watching her now with his head tilted 2 degrees off level, which she had begun to interpret as his thinking expression. And she found herself, against every instinct she had spent the last 8 months reinforcing, narrating her reasoning to him. She said, "The man kicked you without hesitation. That means you were already a problem to him. You can't be a problem to someone who doesn't know you exist." She said, "Which means he knew you or knew about you. Which means you didn't end up in that alley by accident." She said, "You ended up in that alley because someone let you end up there, or because you escaped from somewhere close enough to walk to, injured as you were." She said, "How far can an injured shepherd walk, in how many hours, in this weather, before shelter becomes necessary?" Atlas tilted his head the other 2 degrees, completing the full 4-degree inquiry, and she thought, very much against her will, that this was the most useful conversation she had had in 8 months. She called Dr. Nance at noon. Dr. Nance answered on the second ring and said, without preamble, "The registry trace came back partial. The record for that collar number was edited 14 days ago. The edit removed the dog's assignment history and the name of the assigned handler. But the original creation record was not fully purged," which is the kind of mistake that happens when someone is in a hurry. The creation record shows that Atlas was registered to the Harrow Ridge Extraction Security Division 8 months ago, assigned to a handler whose name was redacted, and trained to a Level 3 working dog certification in protection, tracking, and search and recovery, Marin said. Search and recovery. Yes. And his handler, redacted. Can you reach anyone who might know? There was a pause. Dr. Nance said, "James's notes. I opened the envelope this morning." Another pause, this one of a different quality, not hesitation but weight. She said, "He documented 14 dogs at the Harrow Ridge facility, over 6 months of access, which he gained because Vresh was cultivating goodwill with the veterinary community at the time. 14 dogs. Their collar numbers, their health statuses, their conditions. He documented 2 that he marked as critically neglected. He documented 3 that had been disposed of between his first and second visit. He documented the handler assignments," she said. "The handler assigned to Atlas, whose collar number matches the one on your dog, was a man named Dom Reyes." James noted that Reyes was the most capable handler he had observed, and the one most resistant to the facility's protocols regarding dog welfare. Marin said, "Where's Dom Reyes now, Dr. Nance said. James's last entry, dated 18 days before his hiking accident, says that Dom Reyes was terminated from Harrow Ridge Extraction and that Vresh applied for a reassignment of Atlas to a disposal assessment contractor." James wrote, and I am reading this directly, "R. Gone, dog in jeopardy, must document." And then the notes end. She said, "I think James Farrow was trying to prevent Atlas from being disposed of, and was killed before he could complete whatever he was planning to do about it." Marin held the phone and said nothing for a moment. Outside her window, the storm was thinning, finally, the way storms do when they have delivered what they came to deliver, and have no reason to linger. The trees were visible again. The world was back to the resolution she was used to. She thought about a veterinarian hiking terrain he knew for 20 years and not coming back from it. She thought about the man in the alley and the practiced ease of the kick and the phone call that continued seamlessly after it. She thought about Ruiz and the training accident that was not anyone's fault, and the official report she did not believe, and the weight of the photograph against her sternum. She said, "Petra. The man who fired Dom Reyes. Vresh. If he had a dog labeled for disposal, and that dog escaped or was released, and that dog ended up in town, and the wrong person found that dog," she said, "he would be motivated to manage that situation." Dr. Nance said, "Yes." How would he manage it? Quietly. Through people he pays to be quiet on his behalf. And if quiet wasn't sufficient, through people he pays to be other things. Marin said, "How close is Harrow County to Crestfall Ridge?" 40 minutes on a good road. 25 on private timber access routes. She said, "I want to see James Farrow's notes." "Dr. Nance said, I had a feeling you were going to say that. Come for dinner. 6 o'clock. I'll make something that isn't coffee, which is what I've been surviving on since this morning." That evening, driving to Dr. Nance's place on the far side of Crestfall Ridge, Marin watched her mirrors with the deliberate casualness of a person who checks mirrors because the alternative is not checking them. The road was clear and empty in the late afternoon dark. She was almost certain, 3/4 of the way there, that nothing was following her. She was 100% certain, seeing the same pair of headlights persist through 3 consecutive turns, that she had been wrong. She did not change her speed or her route. She pulled into Dr. Nance's property, a small spread with a detached clinic building and a house with lights burning warm in 2 windows, and she sat in the truck for a moment after parking and watched the road, The headlights did not turn in. They continued past. She counted the seconds. At 43 seconds, the headlights came back, moving slowly in the other direction. She noted the vehicle profile, which was a pickup she did not recognize, dark-colored, nothing distinctive except its patience. She went inside and said, "You may want to know that we have an audience." Dr. Nance looked at her over the kitchen counter with the expression of a person receiving expected news, and said, "James used to say that the only time Vresh's people weren't watching was when they wanted you to think they weren't." She said, "Sit down. Eat something first. The notes will be better on a full stomach, and so will your judgment." Marin sat down and ate something, which was a lentil soup that was so straightforwardly good that she felt slightly ambushed by it. The way genuine nourishment sometimes surprises the body that has been running on minimal input for too long. Atlas had come with her, riding the passenger seat again with his careful, proprietary calm, and he was currently under the kitchen table, doing what working dogs do in unfamiliar territory, which is establish the layout with their nose, and then declare a spot and occupy it with authority. After dinner, Dr. Nance put James Farrow's field notes on the table between them. They were handwritten in a small, precise script on quadrille-ruled pages, the kind of notes a careful scientist writes when he knows they may have to stand on their own. They were thorough, they were numbered, they documented what Marin had been expecting to find, which was systematic neglect, overbreeding. Dogs moved through the Harrow Ridge operation with the administrative efficiency of inventory, used for contracted security work, and then disposed of when injury or age reduced their economic utility. But they documented something else, something buried in the final 8 pages, which were the pages James Farrow had written with the increased urgency of a man who had realized that what he was documenting was not only cruelty, but camouflage. Because the Harrow Ridge K9 operation was not primarily a security contracting business, it was primarily a surveillance and intelligence gathering operation for Vresh's extraction interests, using trained dogs and their handlers to run covert assessments on land that Vresh was targeting for resource extraction, including land that was legally protected, land that was under conservation trust, and land on which a competing party had an active legal claim. Marin read this 3 times. She said, "He's using trained search and recovery dogs to assess protected land for extraction viability." Dr. Nance said, "And disposing of the dogs and the handlers who know about it, once the assessment is complete." Marin said, "Dom Reyes." Dr. Nance said, "James's notes say Reyes had become increasingly unwilling to run his dog on protected land. Insubordinate, the facility logs call it. I think he had a conscience." She paused. James was trying to find Reyes. He thought if he could get Reyes's testimony together with his own documentation, there was a case for the State Land and Resources Board, as well as for animal welfare enforcement. She said, "He never got there." Marin said, "But Reyes might still be alive. Vresh fired him rather than disposing of him, at least according to the record. Firing first, then determining whether he'll be a problem later. Yes, that's consistent with Vresh's pattern." Dr. Nance said, "If Reyes is out there, he knows things no document does. He knows them in his body, the way a handler knows their dog. He worked with Atlas for 8 months. He knows what Atlas was used for and where." Marin said, "Then we need to find Dom Reyes before Vresh decides he's a problem." Outside, the road was quiet. The dark pickup had not returned. That worried Marin more than its presence had. She called the county warden's office the next morning, and this time someone answered, which was a man named Warden Cal Briggs, who had the voice of a person who had been managing other people's emergencies for long enough to have developed a considered skepticism about the scale at which they were generally reported. He listened to what Marin said, which she delivered in the same sequential, non-dramatic format she had used with Dr. Nance, and he said, "You're telling me you found an injured dog in a service alley, a dog with a registry collar showing signs of deliberate neglect and possible restraint injury, And you are connecting this to the Harrow Ridge extraction operation in Harrow County. Marin said, yes. He said, that's a large leap. She said, I'm happy to show you the field notes of the deceased veterinarian whose documentation connects them. There was a pause of a length she took as meaningful. He said, deceased veterinarian. Dr. James Farrow, hiking accident, 2 years ago. His colleague has his notes. Another pause. He said, I know who James Farrow is. He said it in a way that made clear that knowing who James Farrow was included knowing how he died and having found the category of hiking accident unsatisfying. He said, you said you're in Crestfall Ridge. I can be there by afternoon. I'll have coffee ready, Marin said, though I should tell you, the dog has claimed the best chair. Briggs arrived at 2:15 in a county vehicle that had done real work in real weather and showed it. He was a large man in his 50s, the kind of large that is not threatening but is structural, as if he had been built to be in a certain kind of landscape, and this landscape was it. He had a gray mustache and the patient, evaluative eyes of a man who has learned that the first version of any story is almost always incomplete, and has organized his entire professional practice around establishing what the second and third versions say. He took off his coat at the door, accepted coffee, looked at Atlas for a long moment and said, that's a military collar. Marin said, yes. He said, where'd you get it? She told him. All of it, including the man in the alley. He listened without interrupting, which she respected because interrupting was a way of managing a narrative, and he was letting the narrative manage itself. When she finished, he said, the man you're describing. The kick in the alley. If I were to show you a photograph. She said, I would know him from 40 meters in low light. He put a photograph on the table. She looked at it and said, yes. He picked up the photograph. He said, I need you to understand something. Callum Vresh is a name that carries weight in this county and in the county to the north. The people who need to be moved to act are the people he has spent 15 years making it expensive to inconvenience. He said, I am not telling you this to discourage you. I am telling you this because the way you handle the next steps is going to determine whether what you have becomes a case or becomes a story that Vresh's attorney turns into a harassment complaint. He said, I need clean evidence, documented chain of custody, a witness who will testify, and I need to do this without you going up to Harrow County and doing something that gives him a legal argument. Marin said, I was not planning to go to Harrow County. He looked at her with the evaluative eyes. He said, were you not? She said, I was planning to find Dom Reyes, who is a private citizen and former employee who is not on Vresh's property and who may be the witness you need. Briggs said, He drank his coffee. He said, I'll pull the employment termination record for Reyes through the County Labor Board. It'll have a last known address, he said. Officially. She said, unofficially. He said, unofficially, if you find him first, you tell him his options. You tell him what documentation already exists. And you tell him that what he chooses to do with that information is his own business, and that I will meet him somewhere of his choosing to take his statement. And he said, that's the closest thing to cooperation I can offer you outside of procedure. She said, that's enough. He put the coffee cup down and looked at Atlas and said, he doing okay? She said, getting better. He said, good dog, to Atlas, who received this assessment with the dignified acknowledgement of an animal that knows its own value and does not require external validation, but is not ungracious about receiving it. Briggs put his coat on and said at the door, be careful. The people Vresh pays to be quiet and to be other things. They're not sophisticated, but they're not subtle either. And unsophisticated and direct is its own kind of danger. He drove away into the afternoon. Marin stood at the door for a moment, and Atlas came and stood beside her, his shoulder against her leg, looking out at the same middle distance she was looking at, and she thought, not for the first time, that this dog had been doing search and recovery work for 8 months before he arrived in her alley. That his entire trained purpose was to find what was hidden. She thought about Ruiz and the official report, and the training accident and the evidence she did not have. And she thought about how a person becomes someone who cannot trust what is not proven to them in triplicate. And she thought about the distance between that and being someone who acts on what they can see in front of them, which is a living thing in pain asking to be believed. She found Dom Reyes in 2 days. She found him through the particular network that exists among people who have served, the web of obligation and mutual recognition that persists after the uniform is gone. People who know people who were in certain places at certain times, and who ask questions without needing to know the full reason. He was in a rented room above a machine shop in a small town 20 minutes south of Crestfall Ridge. Which meant he had not gone far, which meant he either could not or would not. And when she understood that he had nowhere to go, because Vresh had made sure of it, had put him into a legal and financial situation that kept him within a certain radius, she felt the anger take up its full space again. And this time she let it, because some anger is accurate and suppressing accurate anger is its own kind of lie. She went to him without announcement. She knocked on the door above the machine shop, and he answered it with the specific wariness of a person who has been waiting for a knock on the door, and has not been sure whether it would come from a direction he wanted. He was in his early 30s, lean, dark-haired, with the particular quality of contained damage she recognized from mirrors. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked down and saw Atlas, who was at her heel, and his face did something that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the thing that lives underneath it. He said, "Atlas," very quietly. Atlas crossed the threshold without waiting for an invitation and pressed himself against Dom Reyes's legs and stayed there, and Dom Reyes put his hand on the dog's head and left it there, and the two of them stood in the posture of reunion that does not require any language, because all the language was already said during the months of working together and the silence since. Marin said, "I need you to know what we have. And I need you to know that you are not alone in this." He looked up, and he said, "Who are you?" She said her name. She said what she had been and what she was doing now. She said, "I found him in an alley in Crestfall Ridge 4 days ago. He had been beaten and abandoned." She said, "He led me to you. Not literally, but close enough." Dom Reyes sat down on the stairs and put his arms around Atlas, and did not try to manage what happened to his face. And she stood there and gave him the space of it. Because some moments are not for efficient processing. They are for the body's honest response to the restoration of something it had given up. He testified. Not that day, but the day after, once she had explained the documentation, and the field notes, and the warden's conditions. He sat in a room with Briggs and Dr. Nance, and a state land resources investigator who Briggs had contacted through channels that were clean and documented, and he gave them 3 hours of testimony that was specific and dated and cross-referenced with James Farrow's notes in ways that were not coincidental, the way truth corroborates itself across independent sources, not because it has been coordinated, but because it happened, and things that happened leave the same marks in different records. He described the land assessments. He described the protected parcels where he had run Atlas on Vresh's instruction, tracking survey markers and evidence of prior mineral assessment to establish the legal vulnerability of the Conservation Trust. He described the 2 other handlers who had been terminated before him. He described the dog he had watched loaded into a contractor's vehicle and not returned. He described the specific moment during the 7th assessment run when he had understood what the information Atlas was recovering would be used for, and had begun to refuse further assignments. He described the morning Vresh had called him into the facility's office and fired him with the warm, courteous finality of a man who has cleaned something off his hands. He described what had been said to him that morning, quietly, in the register of smooth menace, about what happens to people who bring complicated stories to complicated forums. He described Atlas being taken from him. He said, "He's a good dog. He does his job because he trusts you. He doesn't know what the information gets used for." "That's not on him," he said. "It's on the person holding the leash." Marin, sitting at the edge of the room, thought about that for a long time after. The events of the following 2 weeks were not dramatic in the way she had been trained to expect consequence. Which is to say, they did not arrive with urgency and noise, but with the slow, grinding persistence of institutional process when it finally has enough to move. Briggs filed with the state. The Land Resources Board opened an investigation. An injunction was placed on Harrow Ridge Extraction's active lease applications, while the integrity of the site assessments was reviewed. The State Animal Welfare Division opened a parallel investigation into the K9 facility. A county prosecutor's office in Harrow reviewed the Faro field notes, together with Dom Reyes's testimony, and the registry records, and the chain of custody for Atlas. And 2 investigators drove up the private timber access routes to the Harrow Ridge facility, with a warrant that had not been coordinated with Callum Vresh's legal team in advance, and what they found there did not improve his situation. She was not there for any of it. She was not supposed to be. Briggs had been explicit about that, in his plain-spoken way, and she had understood that her role was not the confrontation, but the accumulation. Not the spectacular moment, but the documented one, and she had held that understanding even on the day she saw a photograph in a news aggregator of Callum Vresh leaving a county courthouse in Harrow with his attorney, the charcoal overcoat replaced by a dark suit, still smooth, still composed, still wearing the confidence of a man who has not yet had to fully reckon with the consequence of being seen. The case would take time, it would be tedious. It would live in filings and motions and cross-referenced evidence, and the deliberate, plodding mechanics of a system that moves slowly, but moves with weight when it finally moves. She knew this, and she accepted it. And accepting it was not nothing, because she had spent most of her adult life believing that the people who moved with weight and speed were the ones who mattered, and learning that the slow ones, the documented ones, the ones who showed up with ledgers rather than urgency, were the ones who built something that lasted. On the day the state posthumously cleared James Farrow's professional record, which had been quietly and without announcement undermined by a series of complaints filed by Harrow Ridge Extraction in the 2 years since his death, Dr. Petra Nance called Marin and did not say much. She said his name. She said, "He was right." She said, "He was right, and they knew he was right, and they did what they did anyway." She said, "That doesn't go away. But at least now the record says what happened." She paused. She said, "He would have liked Atlas." Marin said, "Atlas likes being liked. He has opinions about it." "Doctor." Nance made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something older than a laugh. She said, "Thank you, Marin." She said it simply and did not dress it up, and it landed with the specific weight of words that mean exactly what they say. That evening Marin sat on the cabin porch with Atlas at her feet and watched the last of the winter perform its theatrical withdrawal from the mountain. The snow was pulling back from the lower elevations, revealing the brown and gray of the ground beneath with the sheepish manner of something caught at an excess. And in the places where it had retreated longest, there were the first indications of what would become green. Not yet, but the suggestion of it, the way light changes on a hillside in late winter to announce without committing. She had the photograph in her hands, out of the pocket, which was unusual. She looked at it for a while. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and what she was still working to find out, because the training accident was still there. Still unexplained to her satisfaction, still carrying the weight of the thing you cannot resolve, but cannot put down. She thought about Dom Reyes's words in the rented room above the machine shop. He doesn't know what the information gets used for. That's not on him. It's on the person holding the leash. She thought about what she was holding. She folded the photograph and put it back in her pocket, and she thought, with the tentative, provisional clarity of someone arriving at a thought they have been approaching for a long time from a long way away, that carrying it was not the same as being trapped by it. That a photograph is not a cage, unless you decide it is. That the weight against the sternum was not punishment and not obligation but memory, which is what we give to people we have lost because we cannot give them anything else. And that it was enough, it would have to be enough, and on some days, it actually was. Dom Reyes came back to Crestfall Ridge in March, when the road was reliable enough to merit it, and when Briggs had confirmed that there was no legal reason he couldn't relocate, and about 11 good practical reasons that he should. And he came with 2 boxes and a sleeping bag, and the careful provisional manner of a person who has been told good news before, and learned to wait before fully believing it. He moved into the spare room of a small house 3 miles from Marin's cabin that Dr. Nance knew of from a patient whose family had moved south the previous fall. He came with his expertise and his hands that knew how to work with dogs, and the specific, hard-won knowledge of what Atlas had been through, and what Atlas was going to need to fully recover. It took 6 weeks of careful, consistent, knowledgeable rehabilitation before Atlas put his full weight on the left foreleg without compensating. On the day it happened, Dom Reyes stood in the cabin kitchen and watched the dog walk from the rug to the door and back again, and he put his hand over his mouth and did not speak for a moment. And Marin looked away to give him the privacy of it, and when she looked back, his hand was down and he was looking at the ceiling, the way people look at ceilings when they are managing the contents of their face, and he said, "Good boy," and Atlas sat down in front of him and put one paw forward with the elaborate dignity of a dog, receiving a commendation he has known for some time was coming, and has chosen not to hurry. They established the fund in April. Dr. Nance handled the charter. Dom Reyes provided the operational knowledge. Briggs connected them with the County Animal Welfare Board, which had been waiting with the undemonstrative patience of an institution that believed in the work and had lacked the coalition to make it happen, for someone to walk in with the documentation and the will. They called it the Pharaoh Fund, because some names need to be said out loud in living contexts, or the silence around them becomes a kind of erasure, and James Pharaoh had been right, and had paid for being right, and deserved, at the very least, to have his name on the thing that proved it. The fund would provide veterinary support and legal advocacy for working dogs in abusive or neglectful contracted operations throughout the state. It would take cases and document them and build the kind of record that lasts long enough to survive the patience of people who want it not to exist. It was not ambitious in the way that makes noise. It was ambitious in the way that makes change, which is slow and requires more than one person, and does not resolve in a single clean moment, but in the accumulation of many unremarkable ones. On the last Saturday of April, which was clear and cold, in the mountain way of clear and cold, which means bright and direct and without apology, Marin took Atlas to the tree line at the back of the cabin property. She had been told by Dr. Nance and by Dom Reyes, and by every piece of knowledge she had assembled over 4 months, that a dog like Atlas, trained to the level he was trained, needed open space and work to be fully himself, that convalescence was a stage and not a destination, and that a dog who had been an asset for 8 months of active working life, and who had survived what he had survived, did not belong on a rug in a cabin, however warm the rug, however good the company. She had known this was coming. She had been preparing for it in the particular, ineffective way you prepare for something you cannot fully prepare for, which is mostly just being aware of the approaching fact of it and trying not to bargain. She stood at the edge of the tree line and unhooked his leash and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing to say, and Atlas stood at the edge for a moment and looked up at her. He looked at her for long enough that she understood it was deliberate, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, the specific, held attention of an animal that knows what it knows and chooses to communicate it before moving on. She looked back at him and did not look away. She said, "Go on," very quietly. And it might have been permission, or it might have been simply a door opening, which amounts to the same thing. He went, not fast, not the velocity of escape, but the steady, purposeful motion of an animal moving toward its own nature, and she watched him go until the tree line took him, and the dark between the trees was just trees again, and she stood at the edge for a while with the empty leash in her hands and the morning cold on her face, and the particular quality of stillness that follows a thing when it is finished. She thought about what Dr. Nance had said on the first morning, about mercy not erasing grief but reordering it. She thought about the photograph in her pocket and the weight of it, which was the same weight it had always been, but which she was beginning to understand she could carry at a different angle, one that left her hands freer. She thought about the man in the alley, and the practiced ease of the kick and the phone call that continued seamlessly after it. And she thought about how small that gesture had been and how far it had traveled. The way a stone in a quiet lake generates rings that reach the shore long after the stone is settled and still at the bottom. She thought about Atlas at the tree line looking back at her, and about Dom Reyes in the kitchen watching the dog walk across the floor on 4 good legs, and about Dr. Petra Nance saying he was right, and they knew he was right, and the record now says what happened, and about Warden Briggs saying good dog to an animal in the best chair and meaning it without irony. She had gone out in a storm to buy ice melt for the steps and a light bulb for the porch, and she had not come back the same person, because the thing that was waiting in the alley had not been looking for a hero, only for someone who would stop when stopping was inconvenient, who would choose the living thing in front of them over the errand, who would hold the weight of it without flinching and carry it home. She had been trained to do many things, some of them large and some of them terrifying, and some of them things she would carry all her life, in ways she was still learning to manage. She had not been trained to stand in a service alley in a snowstorm and recognize herself in a dog pressed against a brick wall. That had not been in any manual she was given, and yet it had been perhaps the most important thing she had ever been equipped for, the accumulated capacity for witness, the hard-won ability to see a thing clearly and decide that its survival matters, and stay until the work is done. There is a kind of rescue that does not announce itself. It arrives injured and urgent and inconvenient at the worst time in the worst weather, asking nothing except that you not look away. And if you do not look away, if you choose the living thing in front of you over every internal argument for why now is not the moment, and this is not your problem, and the road is getting worse, and the errand is still waiting, you will find eventually, and not without cost, that you were not saving it alone, that it was finding you, that whatever had been closed in you was not sealed, only latched, and needed only the right kind of arrival, wounded and patient and looking directly at you to open it again. Marin walked back to the cabin with the empty leash and the morning light coming full through the pines and the smell of wood smoke from the stove she had left banked against the cold. Dom Reyes had made coffee, which was strong enough to be a philosophical statement. And Dr. Nance was coming at noon to go over the fund's first quarterly filing, and Briggs had left a message about a follow-up inquiry from the State Land Board, and there was work to do. There was always going to be work to do, and she sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the warmth go in, and she breathed, and she named the ground beneath her boots, and she named the warmth in her hands, and she named, silently and without rushing, the person she was carrying, and she did not put him down, but she sat with him differently, in the way you sit with the people you love when you are no longer only grieving them, but also, carefully, building something in the room beside the grief, something with a roof and a door and a light in the window and room enough for whoever needs to come in from the cold. Some things arrive quietly, grace especially. It does not knock with confidence. It limps up your alley in a storm, bearing the evidence of every careless hand that was ever laid on it, asking only to be let in. And when you open the door, when you make room, when you choose the living thing over every convenient reason not to, you will discover that the door you opened was yours, and that you have been the one outside, waiting in the cold, for much longer than you knew.